Welcome back to the Sherry Sylvester Show. Today I'm going to talk with Sewell Chan, who has been the editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune since 2021. During his time at the helm, the Tribune won its first National Magazine Award and was a Pulitzer finalist for the first time. Previously, he was deputy managing editor and then the editorial page editor at the Los Angeles Times. He also worked at the New York Times from 2004 to 2018 as a Metro reporter and Washington correspondent, deputy op-ed editor, and an international news editor. A child of immigrants, Sewell was what we now call a first-gen student, first in his family to graduate from college. He has a degree in social studies from Harvard and a master's in political science from Oxford, where he studied on a British Marshall Scholarship. The Texas Tribune launched on election night in 2009 and has become one of the most successful nonprofit digital news operations in the country. It is the primary producer of content in Texas news, providing a wide range of news stories to local media outlets throughout the state. They have deep influence on the Texas media narrative. TPPF is considered by both our friends and our enemies as one of the most influential, if not the most influential, public policy think tank in the country, though we are described in the Texas press as a right-wing think tank. Sewell and I have been talking for a couple of years now about ways to break down the media silos that divide the national narrative along conservative and progressive lines in order to bring more vibrant and thoughtful conversations to both sides of news reporting. It's just been announced that Sewell is leaving the Texas Tribune to become editor of the Columbia Journalism Review, returning to his native New York and to the heart of the debate over the state of journalism today. I'm going to talk to him about his time at the Tribune and what he sees coming up in Columbia, but I'm also going to talk to him about last night's debate. Sewell, thank you so much for joining me today.
Sherry, thanks for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
What did you see on the debate, which happened Thursday night of last week? What did you see in terms of journalism? CNN was rolling out their best guns.
Well, first of all, thank you to TPPF, which allowed me to join the debate watching last night. So I watched it right here from the Joe Hogsett Theater downstairs. I thought journalistically, look, it's very, very clear that Tapper and Bash have been criticized for not doing more to kind of do, live fact checking during the debate. I think that's a very, very hard thing to do because, frankly, you have two officials trying to discuss very complex policy matters in just under 2 minutes usually. It's not a forum that allows for a lot of that fact checking. Personally, I think a lot of our eyes glaze over when there's a lot of numbers thrown about. There were obviously some numbers on both sides that were confused or misstated. I think, the format, which I think a lot of people thought might work to Biden's advantage, I think ended up working to Trump's advantage. It was, the muted mics, the strict enforcement of the time limits, plus the lack of a live audience. It was thought, that might really, those are, Trump does so well when he's talking with a live audience. But I thought it had the effect actually of making Trump seem a little bit more muted and more sober, and unfortunately for Biden, it had the effect of accentuating his real flubs in terms of his misstatements and his, at times, incoherence.
Well, let me ask you first about the fact checks. Now, I looked at CNN's fact check and I looked at AP's fact checks. And part of the problem in the media silos is that there really isn't a lot of agreement on the facts. And so I believe that had CNN stopped, as reporters sometimes do, and said to Trump, that's a lie, then we would have spent the whole evening interpreting, what do you mean by who did it, who didn't do it? And the fact checks that I've read, essentially, everyone said Biden had a terrible night, but Trump was a liar. But there were a lot of inaccuracies on Biden's side. Neither guy seemed to be really on the money with precision.
It was not a great night for the truth. That said, I do think that there are such things as facts. I deeply believe in that. How many people came into the country last year? How many of them were undocumented? How many of those people may have committed crimes? Those are actual facts.
Absolutely.
I think that there were, at times, gross overstatements made by people on both sides. I thought it was just embarrassing when, Biden talked about there being trillionaires. As much as there is a wealth concentration in the country and the world, no one's worth $1 trillion to my knowledge. A few companies are. He at one point, I think he referred to 15,000 when he meant 15 million. So part of that. Look, what I would say is that we're a country right now where there needs to be an agreement on what facts are, and then there needs to be a healthy and vigorous disagreement over values and trade-offs. Because I think if you understand what the facts are, but then you have disagreements over, again, trade-offs, right? It's not so much that all the truth is ever on one side or the other. It's more about how they want to balance competing values or values that are in tension with each other. And I'm sure we can talk about some of that today.
Yeah, I mean, it may not matter that 8 million, 9 million, 10 million, 4 million people have come across the border compared to how many people came across the border when Trump was president. But it definitely does matter that somebody knows the answer to that and somebody knows who those people are, which is what I think the troubling thing is for a lot of Americans. We see a report, we see people coming in from China, we see people coming in who are coming from troublesome countries in the Middle East. How many of those people? Somewhere between 40 and 400 connected to ISIS. So,
and it's important to, I think a lot of...
I think I'm agreeing with you. Values is what we're after.
No, I agree with that. And look, it's human nature to, sometimes misjudge risk. I think any loss of life, and certainly, if someone's been killed by an undocumented, migrant, that's a horrible thing. At the same time, Trump trades in very, very broad statements, stating that, he implied that migration in general was destroying the United States, which I think a lot of people, including some serious economists, would really question. If we want to talk about, why prices are so high, certainly, choking off a major source of the labor supply, would probably actually have an inflationary effect, and that didn't come up last night.
Well, I think, though, again, that happens on both sides. I think Trump's best answer last night was on abortion. And I think that I would posit to you that I don't think we're necessarily, that the right is necessarily exaggerating about what happens with illegal migrants coming over the border. But I think you get the same kind of thing that women are in distress and abortion is down and people are having to travel to different states and all that. I don't think that there's much evidence of that.
Well, we can agree that each side trades in fear.
Right.
And fear is a more powerful emotion sometimes than love and unity.
Right. Well, now, going back to CNN, let's talk about CNN a little bit. So what about the split screen? It was very interesting. People said, well, why did Trump accept this debate with those two people? And you're assuming that CNN is going to slant it in Biden's favor. But did they make a mistake keeping the camera on Biden through the night?
I'm not a broadcast news expert, but certainly some of Biden's expressions, he seemed at times, I think maybe he was trying to convey, outrage or surprise or disdain, but at times he looked confused. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not a great look, especially when, your age is one of the principal doubts that voters have about you. At the same time, I want to speak up. I think CNN was actually fair. I think that, I saw some tweets Frank Luntz sent last night. I think that they raised important issues. I thought it was very disappointing that both candidates really avoided specific answers on climate change, on child care, on some issues that, the economic status of Black Americans. I think the questions were substantive. I don't know whether it was the format or whether it was the candidates, but it did not feel like a very substantive exchange of actual views.
Yeah, I think that's true. One of the things that struck me about the debate was I only watched CNN. I didn't watch any analysis on Fox because I'm not very interested in I told you so journalism. And one of the things that happened last night for the right is we've been saying this all along. We've been saying he's not ready. He's not clear-minded enough, President Biden, and attacking along those lines. Although, as I said, I think most conservatives would really rather fight about the issues. So, but on CNN, there seemed to be a big table of people who were shocked, advocates. Jones, Alex Jones, I mean, he was practically in tears. You know, he said, "I love this man."
Van Jones?
Van Jones. Yes. Van Jones. But all of the commentators were stunned both by how badly Biden did, and they did a flash poll, and it was 57% thought Trump had won the debate, 33 thought Biden had won the debate.
I'm not surprised by that.
A complete reverse of the numbers from their flash poll in 2020.
Yeah.
So they were dealing with a different reality. For the right, I think, we told you, the guy's not ready. Not ready.
You know, I think there's actually been some pretty good stories about Biden's age in the mainstream media. The Wall Street Journal had a pretty tough story a few weeks ago. There
That's
has
true.
been some coverage in other mainstream news outlets. I don't buy that this was something the mainstream media was hiding. I do agree that any president, especially with the powers of the office, has a lot of power to shape how much the public image. And, you know, we know that Biden has done fewer press conferences. You know, he does fewer unscripted appearances. And so I was not surprised that he did rather poorly. I think he had a bad night. He apparently had a cold or something. I was a little bit more surprised that he had not, seemingly been better prepared, given that we'd been reading about him being at Camp David, for a week or so prepping.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if you think that the media, I think they were not prepared. I think they lost one of the basic understandings of politics, which is the only relevant question is compared to what? And that's what you really saw on the screen last night. People going, oh, well, Trump was lying. Trump was doing this. The only relevant question is compared to what?
Well, and that's a hard question if you're President Biden, because he had said, don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative. And
Right.
last night people had a chance to see the alternative, and they may have decided it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't want to understate it. I think Donald Trump has made very, disturbing statements and continues to about our democracy. And I think that that's something that as journalists makes us very uncomfortable, not on a partisan level, because we really haven't had conservative presidents kind of go after the press the way he has.
Mm-hmm.
It's more on the level of, does he believe in pluralism? Does he believe in genuine contestation and debate? Does he believe in peaceful resolution of things? And I know that a lot on the right, think that the threat to democracy thing is exaggerated. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to say that Donald Trump engages in a lot of flirtation with violence that I think disturbs a lot of people who are accustomed to more kind of mainstream, including conservative American norms and traditions.
And I would counter that from the conservative side, it's disturbing that Biden appears to believe in open borders, that he appears to undermine women's rights by changing Title IX, which is a big concern. And so I think that, again, we're in these silos and you hear what you hear.
And I'm not here to defend either party. I want to be crystal
yeah.
clear about that. I'm very committed to nonpartisan, independent journalism.
Well,
Happy to talk about that.
Well, then what's the state of that? Is it changing? I saw Barry Weiss this morning was out and saying, we told you so. We knew it all along. And she does charge that the media is covering it up. But I wonder, you're going to the Columbia Journalism Review. We're at a time when there is a lot of criticism of the media, the mainstream media being in collusion with the left, and then also the right-wing media, which is also powerful, the media on the right, pushing, not addressing the issues that you're talking about, if they are issues, and so.
Well, I think we have to begin with a question of what do we mean by the media, right? Because it's an incredibly diverse set of activities that are called the media. I think on the one hand, you have kind of traditional newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. You have obviously cable news, which I think, along with talk radio, contributed, frankly, to the polarization of the country where we are right now. And you have increasingly partisan sources of news on both the right and the left. And I think it's important to note that there was a recent study that said that the number of so-called pink slime news sites, which are news sites purporting to be news, but in fact are really thinly veiled or not at all veiled, partisan attack operations. You're seeing that happen on both the right and the left, and I
Right.
really want to emphasize that. And that troubles me because I'm a deep believer that you need sources of news that are impartial, that are professional, that are rooted in facts, and that have policy. And doing those things doesn't mean you're perfect. What it does mean is that you have a series of procedures and a set of ethical principles that undergird your work, and that if you make factual mistakes, you correct them, and that when complaints come in, you listen to those who complain, and you try to understand whether their complaints have merit and how those complaints might be addressed. And those are the principles we stick to at the Texas Tribune. And I think those principles really deserve a lot of defense right now because they are indeed under threat.
Well, that's kind of a question that I want to re-ask. Is there a new kind of journalism developing? Barry's put this out here. We're looking at the 3 people just left Politico this week saying that there was a slant. They didn't want to be involved in a slant. James Bennett accused the New York Times of the left talking to itself. And a lot of times, even in reading the Tribune, I read stories, and it seems to me that they're talking to an audience that discounts the fact that in Texas, conservatives have won every election for the last 25 years. Abbott, who is frequently criticized, Patrick, those people won re-election by over 1 million votes. But still, they're often described as right wing or some kind of fringe. No, this is who the people of Texas have chosen.
Well, sure, I'd push back a little bit. I do not doubt at all that Texas is a very conservative environment, and I think in my tenure at the Tribune, I've always, urged our staff, and in fact, I think our staff has responded very well in covering the state as it is. We're not here to judge what Texas should be. We're not here to say what Texas voters should decide or who they should vote for, or certainly which party. I accept that this is a very, very conservative state, and I do think that we have actually staffers from a variety of backgrounds, including some very conservative ones. And I think that diversity of viewpoint, that diversity of perspective, diversity of what schools people attended. We have a lot of people who attended state schools, and not the elite ones necessarily, or the most elite ones. We have people who went to community college. And one thing I'd point to that I'm most proud of is that the Texas Tribune today has more people across Texas than ever before. Mm-hmm. We're in 10 Texas cities, along with Washington, D.C., and that includes Odessa, Lubbock, Lufkin, McAllen, Fort Worth. And so I think every day our reporters are talking to a wide variety of people. I'm not trying to in any way dismiss or underplay your question about bias. I think it's one that we hear in journalism a lot and we need to take seriously and address seriously. But I also think that some of the examples you gave, especially on the more kind of elite coastal media, that too can be a very insular conversation. And I think I think about journalism the way I do a little bit about politics. How often are we focusing on the bread and butter concerns that affect ordinary people? And we will talk, I think, about some of those issues: school outcomes, health outcomes, what's happening in our environment, the cost of living. And so, I think all of us can do a better job listening with humility. I think we need to find ordinary people and kind of connect the decisions that policymakers make to the lives and experiences of ordinary people on the ground. And I think if we do more of that, we'll rebuild trust and credibility. And if we do less of that and focus only on kind of the talking heads, if you will, or the politicians, whether they be from the left or the right, then we'll be more disconnected from the everyday experiences of Americans.
Yeah, I think it does color our conversations and the coverage about issues. We've been talking about school choice. I mean, and my question to you is, why are we not, half the kids in Texas are not reading or doing math at grade level? And why is that not the opening paragraph of every story? And then let's look at the teachers' unions and their advocates have an approach. They believe more funding would be necessary. For 30 years, conservatives have been looking at, and this is not the only state where I've certainly been in school choice wars out in the Northeast.
Yep.
We're looking for ways to just get kids out of failing mostly urban schools, and getting them into alternative schools. But instead, there's a lot of conspiracy generated. Well, there's it's we're some kind of Christian nationalists for wanting to do this. That there's a lot of religious education in this focus. Don't see it, but.
Well, Sherry, it's a complex issue. I think that on school choice, I want to point out that we have written stories about the Catholic Church and why it wants school choice. We've profiled black families who want to create their own schools to better serve their children and their communities. We had a story this month about STAR scores in decline, and we're currently digging into the struggles of schools in the Odessa and Houston areas. But those stories also have to account for the loss of funding in recent years, in part due to the school choice debate. We also have a School Explorer that gives people access to tons of information about the success or lack thereof of their individual schools, and that's used by thousands of people. So I guess what I'd say is, a lot of the debates over education, and I completely agree that we need to center student outcomes. Mm-hmm. Are children learning? Are they prepared to be A, full citizens in our democratic society, and B, productive and competitive participants in our economy? My personal view is that those two questions have to be front and center. Now, I think the challenge with education, is that I don't think either side has all the answers. I certainly, think that the perspective of teachers' unions that the primary issue is funding runs up against the challenge that even when you have jurisdictions with a lot of per pupil funding, there's still a lot of challenges. Now, I think the challenge from some of the proponents of choice is that a radically decentralized model could yield, well, first of all, in the skimming of kids whose families are motivated, but leave behind, disabled kids with special needs, kids who are the hardest to serve, mm-hmm. whom ultimately the public has to be responsible for. I think also the evidence is mixed on school choice. And one thing we share, Sherry, is that we've worked in both Texas and also in places like New York City. So I've been following these debates for a long time. I'm a proud graduate of the New York City public schools. I'm also under no illusion that our big city, urban school districts are doing the right thing. What I'd point to in Texas is that it's a complicated issue. A lot of the resistance, Republican resistance to school choice has been in rural school districts, in areas where they don't see the school system as this big failing bureaucracy, as parents might in Houston. They still see
even if it is failing.
Well, and I think that's part of the job of the media, right? We need to look at, regardless of who's doing the criticism or what the criticism is about, we have to actually look at the data. And we're trying to do that. We look at the STAR test scores. We have to look at which schools are under threat of closure. And but I'm just saying, as a political matter, if you look in a lot of rural communities, whether it's because of fondness for the football coach or for the school superintendent, a lot of people, or because a lot of people are employed by the school system,
right? Exactly.
You still have a lot of people saying that we want to reform this. We don't want to replace it. I do want to address one thing you raised earlier on. I don't think we have ever characterized the leaders of this state as being in any way fringe. They were chosen by overwhelming majorities mm-hmm. of the state's voters. I think you may be referring to the fact that we do a lot of coverage, frankly, about donors and influencers. There are some people on the far right who are trying to sway major policies in Texas. And I don't think that we're saying that one is the other, but I do think it's fair to say that just like there are major debates dividing the Democratic Party, there's major debates dividing the Republican Party right now mm-hmm. between your kind of more traditional, low tax and low regulation, socially conservative, but ultimately institutionally moderate Republicans who've been the core of the Republican Party's growth and empowerment in the state, and then some folks who are far more activisty. You've seen their influence at the RPT conventions,
right.
and they have their own set of issues, some of which frankly are very focused on culture. And some of them have taken on pretty extreme positions. And mm-hmm. so we're going to document that, but I don't think we're in any way saying that that's representative of the entire ledge or of our state's top elected officials.
I wouldn't challenge that, but I would also say that there's a lot of the same thing going on the left, and maybe you're writing stories about that. Maybe I just don't read them, but that also are disturbing. Or at least disturbing to us.
Well, we've done stories about, for example, debates over trans issues,
right.
which really affect a very small number of Texans, a vulnerable but small number of Texans, and debates within the Democratic Party about whether dissent is allowed on GLBTQ issues. That's one example. But I'd also want to point out that part of the job of journalists is to challenge whoever's in power. And when I was at the LA Times, we were doing stories all the time about homelessness, criminal justice, about affordability, about a lot of things where you had the one party rule in that state and in that city not necessarily delivering good outcomes. I was in charge of the opinion pages during COVID. We did a lot of coverage about learning loss. And, I faced resistance from teachers unions who were like, learning loss? What's that? I think part of it is you got to look at any media organization in the context of what it's trying to report on. And, this is a conservative state, so if it seems that a lot of our coverage is about Republican officials, it's partly because they're the ones in power.
They're the only officials.
But I certainly agree with you that regardless of where we're reporting or what government we're reporting on, we have to stick to that nonpartisan mission. And I think we agree on that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the state of journalism and why you were called to Columbia. I know you had personal reasons, but also why you're called to the Columbia Journalism Review. I'm very interested in what's happening at the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Losing 50% of their audience, and kind of having the newsroom going, we don't care. We don't care. We still want to move forward with these leadership policies that a lot DEI driven, a lot driven by ideology. When Lewis came out and announced that he was going to change leadership, the criticism was, well, you've replaced a man for a woman. And
a woman for a man.
A woman for a man, which seemed to me to be so tangential to the debate.
Yeah.
But you worked at the Washington Post.
I did.
And you probably worked with Busby and
I do know Sally. I also know Matt Murray, who's currently running the newsroom. I think they're both excellent journalists. There's a lot to unpack there. And I'm not an expert on the Post. I've not worked there in 20 years, almost. But of course, I follow these debates closely. The Post is an indispensable institution. I think first let's look a little bit at the economics, right? There has been a drop in traffic across all kinds of publishers, including, by the way, conservative ones. And why is that drop of traffic occurring? First of all, the social media boom has kind of petered out. Facebook has shifted heavily away from news. That's had an impact on all kinds of media, no matter what format, no matter what region, and no matter what kind of political viewpoint is espoused in the opinion sections. You've had now you're seeing potentially threats to search traffic. So most traffic that most media organizations get is actually, or the biggest share, is through search. So people go to Google or Bing and they type in the topic they're interested in. Well, now Google and Bing are interested in giving you search results from generative AI. So if I'm doing, let's say I'm searching, school choice in Texas, instead of bringing me to TPPF's website, which I know is full of resources on school choice, they'll try to summarize an answer based on what you think they're looking for. So I think we're seeing giant changes to the web itself right now, Sherry, that I think are important to understand. Now, that drop off in traffic has resulted, as you say, in less exposure, less audience, and of course, less advertising revenue. And I think the bigger issue here is that the traditional media model was dependent on advertising. A lot of that advertising went away. Now, media companies like the New York Times are trying to, and to an extent the Wall Street Journal, have succeeded in getting digital subscriptions and getting people to pay for news. The problem is only 40% of Americans pay for news. And of that 40%, the median number of news subscriptions is around 2 or 3. And so, everyone, whether you're the Atlantic or, the Bulwark, is trying to compete to be, that second or third subscription. And that makes it a very, very hard and challenging environment. So first of all, I'm sympathetic to all who are trying to fix this environment. I think the perspective of the journalists at the Post, and I know a lot of them, is that the Post produces outstanding journalism, and it does. And that it needs to not be, and that the journalists feel they're being blamed for the fall off in traffic rather than supported with really smart business strategies. Now, obviously, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, one of the wealthiest people in the world. He did hire Will Lewis, who had previously been CEO of Dow Jones, which publishes the Wall Street Journal. And Lewis has made some choices that are controversial, but that he believes are necessary to help turn around the business. So, I don't want to take sides in that. But I do think it's a very complex issue. I think, a big part of it is whether the Washington Post and other companies can really become tech companies and really build strong enough digital products that offer things beyond just news. A lot of people come to the New York Times for the word games and for the recipes and for, product reviews and for sports coverage through The Athletic. which the New York Times acquired. And I think we can all agree those are actually, what's interesting about those things is they're all less political, right? Someone at the Times recently said to me, the more that the wars intensify, the more that roast chicken recipes are popular. And I actually think that is speaks to the political moment we're in. Like, people are tired of all the news about wars and conflict. Sometimes they want coverage that just is about, help them in their daily lives. And so I think companies like the Washington Post and others are struggling to kind of find, things that are not just, depressing news to satisfy readers and attract larger audiences.
Exactly. I'm really anachronistic. In our household, we take the hard copy of the Wall Street Journal, which I really love. We've moved into an inner city condo or downtown condo, and the Wall Street Journal comes in a red bag and the New York Times comes in a blue bag.
That's funny.
which I really love.
I'd prefer a clear bag.
But I don't always. I've usually read the Wall Street Journal online by the time I get to it. But I open it because the cartoon on the editorial page. That's what. Well, I'm going to go one more round on this. I'm wondering if there's something, if the design has become anachronistic in terms of newsrooms. When I came to the San Antonio Express News, which is one of the big papers in Texas, having worked at the Trentonian, the only Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper in Trenton, New Jersey.
Sure.
I never was in the newsroom in New Jersey because there was no, I needed to be in New York, I needed to be around the state. And when I got to Texas, the expectation was that I sit in the chair, that the editor be able to see me or know where I was going all the time. And I found that, just really hampering in the way that I did my work. And I'm wondering if something like that is going on now, where we've got leadership, you've got Lewis standing up and saying, okay, some changes are going to be made, and then you've got a bunch of staff saying, no, changes, no. Saw the same thing at the New York Times with the pushing back against Barry Weiss and the pushing back against Nellie Volz and and James Bennett, where is a different kind of collective kind of emerging to run the news? Is the old executive, we're the executive suite and you guys are the reporters?
There's a lot to reflect.
And you've been in the suite a long time.
So there's a lot to reflect on there, right? I really push back against the narrative that, it's like this army of woke young people who are taking over institutions. I think that's overly simplistic. I think the issues that you mentioned at the New York Times over opinion coverage are actually quite distinct from the issues at the Post, where it's really about what's the appropriate business strategy, who are the kinds of leaders best equipped to lead a strategic reorientation. There's been a lot of controversy, for example, about British versus U.S. journalism values. Some of the stories that the editor Lewis had pegged, who's now not coming, have been associated with in Britain involved, paying sources. That's really considered a no-no in America. And I think that there's pretty broad nonpartisan agreement on that in our journalism traditions, since Watergate at least, it's really been about, sources should reveal information if they feel compelled to do so in the public interest. But that if you were to pay sources for information, it could yield to a lot of, misinformation. Mm-hmm. So that's one example that I don't think is easily about left versus right or anything like that. Look, I do think that across American institutions, there's massive generational change going on. And I would agree that, how people think about decision-making in organizations, how they think about authority, how they think about, people from older generations, counting myself in that now, versus, attitudes that Gen Z and younger millennials have. I think those are profound questions, and I think they affect all kinds of institutions and organizations. So I think in general, you're seeing employees who want a more inclusive and participatory approach in the workplace. And I think you're also seeing a lot of leaders, and again, I think this is true regardless of where you are on the political spectrum or even whatever sector you're in. I think you have a lot of leaders trying to figure out, well, how do we make the best decisions to steward our organizations, but to do it in a way that is respectful and listens to, the young people who are the biggest part of our workforce now.
Is there I just saw some kind of polling coming out of Harris that there's really a lot of agreement about issues.
In America?
In America,
I think there is too.
We agree about the police. We really agree about the media. Nobody supports bad schools, and nobody supports people being treated badly. I think we're very much a live and let live. This is Pride Month. We've got 80% of Texans support same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's even on the cultural things. I don't think there is a huge divide, but maybe you can't. Nobody's going to click you if you go in and go, no story here. And how do you deal with that? Because there are some stories that came out after the debate last week. These are terrible choices.
Well, Sherry,
but nobody wants to read that story.
Yeah, Sherry, there's a lot to unpack there, right? I think if you look at how our society became so polarized, there are many origins to that. I think some of them, frankly, are economic. We've seen inequality rise in this country. I think a lot of conservatives would agree that many communities in the heartland, in the Midwest and the South in particular, felt neglected, felt underseen and underheard, underappreciated, by people on the coast. You obviously have a society undergoing rapid demographic change. I also would not underestimate the role of secularization in our society. Regardless of whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, the reality is that fewer Americans attend church. Mm-hmm. That especially after COVID, houses of worship and traditional institutions that for the vast majority of our history.
How do you think that affects the secularization and kind of the rise of the nuns, non-religious?
Yeah, there are a lot more non-religious people, but I also think that even within, there's a lot more, non-religious people. There's a lot of people who've left traditional mainstream denominations. I'm not a sociologist of religion, but I do think that there are a lot of Americans who are unmoored right now. Mm-hmm. And I wish we had more serious conversations about that. Take, for example, the number of young men who seem disconnected to the economy, disconnected to educational institutions. Again, I'm not trying to stereotype here. I'm not saying they're all sitting in their basements, but we know that there's a group of young men who are disaffected, who are not traditionally, connected to either not marrying as much, apparently not even having sex as much, but not forming families, not establishing economic independence. Young women are doing better by many metrics. And so I think those are not, that's one example of, I think, of a big pressing societal challenge that does not easily break down along partisan lines. And that there are conservative approaches to thinking about it in terms of our culture and about, institutions and norms. And there's also liberal approaches that probably would emphasize, are we doing enough to train young men to participate in the workforce? And so I'm not saying there's an easy answer to that.
No, we have approaches that way too.
Yeah, but we've got to talk about these issues, right? But I completely agree with you, Sherry, that, look, I'm not trying to understate the profound divisions in our society, but I would also argue that, unfortunately, our politics right now is more than ever about personality and tribe rather than policies and values. And I'm always up for good discussions around policies and values. And values are sometimes in tension. I mean, let's look at the gun debate, right? I think the Supreme Court has clearly established that there's an individual right to own a handgun. I think also you see in Texas, especially, I've learned this, a lot of people feel that no, there still is going to be an effort to take away guns. And so how do you assess or balance a constitutional right to own a handgun with the right of people's children to go to school safely and be alive? And so the answers to that are complicated. Some of the responses after Uvalde focused on mental health. Others would like to see some restrictions on certain kinds of guns or on things like bump stocks. And I'm not here to say what's right. I'm just here to say that we need, as a society, to have a more sober and informed debate, to see the facts in front of us and then try to interpret those facts in light of values that are occasionally in tension.
I agree that we sometimes miss the forest for the trees. I worked very hard. One of the issues that I worked on was the banning of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our universities. And one of the things that was so frustrating was that I could not get the press to ask about outcomes. We've had DEI programs almost 20 years in some universities. It has not increased the number of minority students, not increased the number of minority faculty, not increased graduation rates. Those are questions that needed to be asked, but instead it kind of devolved into a social debate about whether or not this particular ideology and how it's being promulgated on campus should be required, if you should be required to sign an oath that you support it before you get hired, which most people wouldn't.
Well, and now you've seen institutions like Harvard move away from, those kinds of diversity statements. And again, I think it's one where there's nuance here, right? There always is. I think that the desire to have our student bodies and educational institutions, be places that are forums for respectful debate and for, students from all kinds of backgrounds. And I think diversity has to include racial and gender diversity, but it also needs to include diversity of perspective, diversity of life experience. I think, people with disabilities, people who've served in the military, people from working class backgrounds, non-elite backgrounds, regardless of race, all need to be better represented at institutions. And so how do we have that more sophisticated debate about all diversity in all its manifestations? I think that's a big challenge for our society. But I also have some optimism that maybe we can get there.
Yeah, and so that's something that we definitely agree on. I mean, my goal has always been in my life to make sure that every kid in Texas who wants to go to college can go to college, and a lot of legislation is directed that way to make sure. So we want to make sure when they get there that we've got a path for them to succeed. Well, let's wrap up here. I'm interested, you're going to the Columbia Journalism Review, and what going in there, so I have two questions. I'm trying to see if I can make them together. I would like to know where in the morning you go first for your news, or you're just reading your own news, and what you'll be looking at when you come in the first day at the Columbia Journalism Review and say, you guys are missing this is where I want to go, or what kinds of questions you're going to ask. So that's a
it's a very broad debate.
Question.
I think first of all, my first job is to meet the terrific folks who work at the Columbia Journalism Review and read the publication even more deeply. I've been reading it for 30 years, but I definitely want to understand more deeply, what it's published in recent years. I want to understand how the staff and the contributors work together, and I want to better understand, what their needs are and kind of how to work with them. I do think this is a time of pivotal, challenge for the press. And by the way, I want to talk about some of the challenges that are overseas that are not within the American framework. You've got governments around the world that are, increasingly authoritarian in nature. Not all of those, are from the right. You got, AMLO in Mexico, who came from a kind of populist leftist background. His record on press transparency and, treating the press fairly has been dismal. He recently, read out a reporter for the New York Times her cell phone number on his press conference to express his outrage that she had the temerity to, report about corruption in his administration. So you can really see authoritarian threats from both left and right. You're seeing a lot of online doxing and harassment of journalists. Our field is becoming a more female field. A lot of women worldwide face so much pressure for doing independent journalism. A lot of doxing, harassments. You have journalists in places like Turkey and Mexico, which are among the most dangerous places in the world to practice journalism. Wow, I think that's a huge challenge. And then here in the U.S., you have all sorts of challenges. Some of them are economic. You got a lot of newspapers that are owned by chains and finance companies where there isn't investment in local communities. One of the things that we have found, Sherry, is that when you talk about local and you take local seriously, that's where people open up. They don't see it as left versus right. They want press that is based in their community. They want investment in news in their community. They don't want it owned by some hedge fund based in New York. And so I think there's a lot to grapple with here. And I think the Columbia Journalism Review has a major voice in, it's always been a respected voice on journalistic ethics and decision making. But now I think it needs to be an even more urgent voice in talking about some of these challenges, economic, technological with AI. And societal and political, some of these pressures that journalists face worldwide. So that's what I'm looking forward to doing next.
Well, we're going to miss you.
Likewise,
We're
Sherry.
going to miss you.
Very kind of you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Best of luck out there, as I know, and New York's not an easy place.
Yeah.
But and Donald Trump knows.
I very much look forward to staying in touch with you, Sherry. Thanks for having me on your show.
Great to have you. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. You can subscribe to the Sherry Sylvester Show at Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Sylvester1630, and if you'd like to receive my 9th in Congress newsletter, which includes weekly winners and losers, you can sign up at the TPPF website, www.texaspolicy.com/9th in Congress.